Lesson number 2, is life random? And that's an important question. Do we have a purpose here, or is this just all by accident? We're going to look at a passage of Scripture that says very clearly that God has a plan, He has a purpose, and you are part of that plan. Therefore, you have a purpose. Now, the problem is the passage we're looking at is arguably the most boring section of the New Testament. It is, and it also begins the New Testament. It's a list of names called a genealogy. When we read it, we go, yeah, who cares? Well, the Jews cared. And the reason they cared was because every name was shorthand for a story that told of God's meticulous care for their people through history. These were their own ancestors that God used to bring salvation through Jesus. So it matters. And I want to show you something that I think is worthy of worship in verse 17. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. So there were 3 sections of Jewish history, each with 14 generations in it. Except there wasn't. If you go and meticulously count them, the first section and the last section do in fact have 14 names. But the middle section, it only has 13 names. Why? Well, maybe that's all Matthew had to work with and he just rounded up. Or maybe he miscounted. Wait a second. What did he do for a living again? Oh yeah, Matthew was a tax collector. No, he didn't miscount. He's good with numbers. So why did he call 13 14? If you fact check him back in 1 Chronicles 1 through 9, list the same list of names, there's not 13 names, there's actually 17 names. So he had 17 names to work with and whittled it down to 13 purposely. Now, don't let that bother you. For the Jews, genealogies were somewhat fluid. I mean, they wanted to get the right names for sure, but if they didn't get them exact because there's a horse thief or someone you didn't like, or you wanted to leave out a name for some purpose, you could. It wasn't like they had to have every name exact. It's not that kind of genealogy. It's the story that we're painting here. So there's no problem leaving out 4 names, but why leave out 4 when you could have had exactly 14? Because Matthew wants to do something very Jewish. It's called the double portion. Usually it was the oldest child got the double portion, but sometimes it was a younger one that was favored. When the father died, if there were 3 children, 3 boys specifically, he would divide the inheritance by 4 and give the favored child a double portion. Or if there were 2 children, he would divide it by 3 and give the favored child the double portion. So who is the favored child in this genealogy? It is King David. And he stands between the first historical period and the second historical period. Give him a double portion and you have exactly 14, 14, 14. By the way, Jews did not have a separate numbering system. And so if you learn to read, you usually learn to read by your name. That's the first word you read, first word you write. And so they would also teach mathematics through the name and give a numerical value to a name. David in Hebrew, spelled with 3 letters, D-V-D. D in the Hebrew alphabet, like ours, is the 4th letter. You want to guess what V is? It's the 6th letter. 4 plus 6 plus 4, 14. And because David is actually the theme of the book of Matthew, that Jesus is the new David, he is the king, sitting on David's throne, according to the prophecies, 14 would have been a compelling argument. Now, the rabbis might have said, I don't believe that Jesus is that king, but they would have said, Matthew, you're clever. We just shake our heads and go, I don't know, that's the right way to interpret the Bible. But Matthew, in his context, was doing what was very Jewish. And it would have been compelling for the early Christians who were, in fact, Jews. And you actually get an insight in the very first verse that is exactly what he's doing. Listen, the book of genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Notice, he put David before Abraham. That's not chronologically accurate, but it is appropriate in this genealogy because David is the central figure of the book of Matthew, because Jesus is that new David. Does God have a plan? Yes, he does. The question is, are you a part of that plan? And you might say, nah, I can't be a part of this plan. Again, the genealogy is going to argue against, because in this genealogy, there are actually 4 women listed, which is very unusual for Jewish genealogies. And what these women are saying, you've got Tamar, who had a kind of inappropriate sexual exploit with her father-in-law, Rahab, who had an inappropriate sexual past with being a prostitute, Ruth, who was a foreigner who marries Boaz, and that's an interesting story of how she lost her husband and came to get a new husband. As a foreigner, they would have accused her of being sexually inappropriate. And Bathsheba, of course, well, that was an affair with David. And then there's Mary, who, though innocent, would have been accused of sexual impropriety. See, all of these women had a past, but their past did not debar them from being a part of a future Messiah. And your past does not limit you. It does not prohibit you. It doesn't ruin your future with Jesus. This genealogy is important. Does God have a plan? Yes. Can you play a part of that plan? Oh, yes.